Hi guys, Dr. Dinka here with a lecture about the article that we're studying for our class, Why Latin America by Thomas Skidmore and Peter Smith. I'd like to go over some of the main points of the article, and I'm going to share the screen. And also I have some additional information about Latin America because you mentioned in your discussion posts that you are interested in finding out more about this region. Okay, so let me share the screen. All right, so actually this article that we are studying and that you guys read, it's part of an introduction to a book published in 1992. It's called Modern Latin America, and the goals for the article is to explore some of the reasons to study Latin America. And the authors start with a quote by James Preston, who was the Dean of US Political Commentators, who mentioned that the US will do anything for Latin America except to read about it. And I'd like for you to think about the statement. Do you agree with it and why? And also think about what is your own motivation for studying Latin America. As the article states, first one is economic interests. So our nation's economic interests are deeply involved in the region. Latin America is one of the major trading partners, and it is the site of much U.S. investment and a source for oil and other critical raw materials. And we'll talk more about this later in the semester. Next, we have the political links. Again, we're not going to analyze this in detail since we'll discuss it later. And a very important point that the authors make is the Hispanization of the USA. So Latin America is also part of the culture and of the society of this country. And a lot has to do with migration and border changes. And I quote from this article, a very important statement says there is another important consideration close to home. Large sections of our country have become Hispanized by the influence of migrants from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And this is in addition to the Hispanic descendants of the original Spanish-speaking population of the formerly Mexican Southwest. So migration, both historical and recent, and brought people and customs from Latin America to the American Southwest, from Texas to California. I'd like for you to think about this statement as you watch the film La Misma Luna, Under the Same Moon, and also the short documentary about the border town, Rio Rico. Okay, so if we think about the way the Americas, right? So both North America and South America look today. It's the divisions, right, for country and regions and where they stand was a little bit different than a few centuries ago. Okay. So, for example, even in the 1970s, if we think about how the US territories used to look back then. So actually this, including Ohio, used to be, as you can see on the map, this is from the 1700s, used to be a French colony. Okay, so through some historical events, France was not prepared at the time to have enough people to defend its territories, but at one point, even Ohio was part of um, France, and that's why we still have some names of places, of towns. We have Vermillon, we have in Ohio, we have Bellefontaine. People call it Bellefontaine, but it's Bellefontaine. If you go to Detroit, so that's actually was Fort Detroit, so that was actually a fortress, a trading post right here. So just taking a trip to Detroit and you see all these names of neighborhoods, of streets that still have French names, um, it's very impressive. And even the United States, of course, was, as we mentioned, was part of France, and then later on, some of the territories were still different. Okay, so in the 1800s, the newly independent United States of America was neighbored by colonies established by other European nations, including Spain, France, and Britain. And a lot of times there were wars and fights for these territories because, of course, these territories were bringing wealth to the European powers who claimed them. Okay, so this is from National Geographic. So we see here that so Louisiana, it moved a little bit, okay, because these territories were so the French were defeated, right? So then United States was this, okay? The country right here, then we have Canada and these territories that belong to Great Britain. So this, of course, was France. And then here, what today we have the states of California, Nevada, Utah. So you can see here that these were called the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So these territories from the 1500s all the way to the 1800s, they belonged to Spain. Okay, so it was called a Viceroyalty. And we have here another map. It's about the viceroyalties in Latin America in 1780. So in the late 18th century, viceroyalties in Latin America displayed the efforts of the Spanish Bourbon monarchy to establish more direct control of the colonies. So as I mentioned this, we have the Rio Grande in what's California today. All these territories actually belong to Spain. And what happened? Well, we have also the Viceroyalty of Peru, of La Plata, Viceroyalty of New Granada. So all of these were Spanish territories. Now, in the 1800s, these territories became independent from Spain, and we'll talk more about it when we look at the fight for independence. So just like the United States became independent from England, so these other territories became independent from Spain. So this is when we have the figure of Simon Bolivar, who was actually a revolutionary who was fighting to set free all of these territories. His vision, though, was for a united South America, just like you have United States of America. He wanted a united South America, but that didn't happen for several reasons, mainly because of the elites were not comfortable with losing power, with sharing their wealth with other regions. So if we think about this, right, we have all these territories that for about 300 years were part of Spain. We have people from Spain and then different ethnicities. We have indigenous populations. We have people from Africa who lived in these territories. But what happened? Well, later on in the 1800s, we have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that brought an official end to the Mexican-American War and was signed on February 2nd, 1848 at Guadalupe Hidalgo. So a city north of the capital where the Mexican government had fled in the advance of the U.S. forces. So by its terms, Mexico ceded about 55% of its territory, including the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of Arizona and Colorado, and parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. And Mexico also relinquished all claims to Texas and recognized the Rio Grande as the southern boundary of the United States. So when we talk about the documentary, we studied the documentary about Rio Rico, keep this in mind, okay? So what happened with all these territories that now it's not that they moved, but the border moved, okay? So the border moved south, okay? You can actually find more information about this. I'll put the link on Canvas. Let me see if I can share this with you right now, this link. And it's very interesting because, as I mentioned, all these territories were part of Spain and became part of Mexico and then became incorporated to the United States. Okay. So if we go to this link, you can actually see this is a copy of the treaty. This treaty was actually both in Spanish and in English, okay? And you have it here, of course, it's a contested document because some people don't agree with that. If you talk to somebody from Mexico, for example, they will say that the president at the time was not looking for the best interests of Mexico. So this is where you have the map. We have to keep this in mind as we watch this film too, okay? So remember, all of these territories, as we mentioned, California especially, were part of Spain and then part of Mexico. So those of you, if you have traveled to California, not only will you see names of places, right, that are in Spanish, such as Los Angeles, San Francisco, Santa Barbara, a lot of names, Sacramento, a lot of names of saints and places named by the Spaniards who were very religious, okay? Even the city of Los Angeles, the Angels, was originally named by Spaniards. But you'll see a strong presence of Latinos in this region. And if you go to, for example, parts of Los Angeles to East LA, you see all these people and you still have houses that are different than in other parts of the US. And why is that? Well, as I mentioned, because for hundreds of years, they were part of a different culture, a different region. So we'll talk more about it later in the semester, but for right now, think about why there's such a huge number of Hispanics in this part of the country, okay? Because traditionally they belonged to a different culture, they belonged to a different linguistic group. And then when they became incorporated to the United States, those people still kept their traditions, still kept their culture, okay? All right, so let's continue. And I put a link to the Rio Rico documentary. And the question is, what stood out to you the most about the short video, The Border Town That Forgot It Was Part of the US by BBC News? And what importance did Rio Rico have for both the USA and Mexico? Another important point that the article makes why Latin America is about bilingualism in the USA. So USA is one of the biggest Spanish-speaking populations. So actually more after Mexico, even more people in the US speak Spanish than Spain, where Spanish originated. And the article goes on to talk about stereotypes of Latin Americans. Stereotypes go hand in hand with ignorance. For example, you have the Frito Bandito, who was used as a caricature to sell the Fritos chips. Then you have the Latin lover. You have the stereotypes promoted by the media. So our goal in this class is to move past the stereotypes to study the actual culture, okay? And also, Latin America, just as the United States, is a place with a lot of diversity of people from different backgrounds, For example, a lot of Latinos in Argentina are of Italian descent, and generalizations are not appropriate. And that's why, for example, if somebody meets one person from the United States, so somebody from outside, they cannot base their opinion about the country as a whole on one person or one group. Okay. So that's why these generalizations are not appropriate, and we need to look beyond stereotypes and to understand the complexity of Latin America. Now, the article continues with the assertion that Latin America is not an easy place to understand, despite the fact that the same language, Spanish, is spoken everywhere, except for Brazil, where they speak Portuguese, and Andes, where they speak Quechua and other indigenous languages. But you also have in the Caribbean, where they speak French, English, and Dutch. Quechua, it's actually a language that's being taught at the Ohio State University in Ohio. And what's interesting about it, I had a colleague who was teaching this, he is from Bolivia, is that the greeting in Quechua is Amasua, Amaluya, Amakea, which means don't steal, don't lie, don't be lazy. So instead of saying hello, that's one of the ways that people who belong to this group in the Andes greet each other. So this language has been around for thousands of years, and it's very interesting the language that they use, right, when people greet each other. Now, we mentioned that what's known today as Latin America at one point was a Spanish colony. And we have also a mix of native populations, ethnic and racial complexity in Latin America. But also, very interestingly, this term Latin America covers a vast variety of peoples and places. And geographically, Latin America includes the landmass extending from the Rio Grande border between Texas and Mexico to the southern tip of South America, plus some Caribbean islands, total area of 2.5 times the size of the USA, and Brazil itself is larger than continental US. And also something that people don't know. So there's Latin America, not everybody speaks Spanish, and not all these countries are actually independent. So if you think about French Guiana, it's it's sort of a colony, but in modern terms, it's an overseas department of France, one of the last what they call colonies of modern times. So it's an overseas department of France on the northern east coast of South America here, composed mainly of tropical rainforest, and you have the ruins of 17th century Fort Cepero, overlook the capital Cayenne and its colorful Creole houses and street markets. And I can put a link to, this is an optional link for you guys to see the food, this rich and amazing food that they have in French Guiana. So again, there's a complexity, right, in this region, because at one point there were three Guianas. So there was the Dutch Guiana, French Guiana, and a British Guiana, right? So again, all of these, of course, they spoke Dutch in that part of the of Guyana, and then it's surrounded by all these other countries of that where they speak Spanish, but also we have Brazil. Okay, so if we think back to this modern map, and some of you even commented about the size of Brazil. Why is Brazil so big, right? So if you look at Portugal, because this was a Portuguese colony, so Portugal is a small country in Europe. So how did they end up with such a big chunk of land? It has to do with history. So at the time when all these territories were being discovered and these European powers were claiming them, the Portuguese actually went to the Pope. So originally they only gave them, because the Pope was in charge of, at the time, assigning who gets what from these new lands. He was one of the people who was deciding that. So the Portuguese, they had a small part of this territory, and because at the time it was not known exactly how big South America was, so the Portuguese actually went back to the Pope, and it's what it's called the Tratado de Tordesillas, Treaty of Tordesillas. The Pope actually gave them more territory, and that's how the Portuguese ended up with Brazil, that then became independent from Portugal. Okay, another important point of the article is the political complexity. So we have different political regimes. A lot of the countries in Latin America are democracies, but we have the case of Cuba, where it's a communist regime, and we'll study again this later in the semester. It's very fascinating the way this works in the way people live, because um, it's hard to imagine for people who have lived in the United States all their lives to understand this concept that the economic power is in theory supposed to be controlled by the state, which in turn is controlled by the people. There is no private enterprise. So think about all these private companies in the US. Not really in Cuba, because supposedly the states owns everything. And ownership of property and the means of productivity are transferred to the state, which means individual property rights must be curtailed. But what's the problem with it? Well, the state doesn't have the capabilities to manufacture everything. So that's why you see in Cuba all these cars from the 50s and 60s from the United States that are still running, because the country is not able right now to manufacture cars. So uh, you have the embargo, you have other situations where they're not allowed, or the country simply doesn't want to import um, cars. So people actually have to repair these cars from the 50s and 60s, and sometimes you have Russian cars too. But that's how people get around. So it's such an interesting concept, and hard to imagine. And when you study Cuba, you'll see that the average monthly wage is about $40 a month. Doctor makes about between $150 and $300 a month. Okay, so imagine living in the type of um, country and under that type of regime, and trying to make ends meet and trying to get ahead in life. And it's very hard. That's why you see people resorting to extreme measures to immigrate, right? So people leave Cuba on makeshift boats and trying to reach the US. Okay. All right. So another contrast in Latin America that the article talks about, and it goes hand in hand with the previous topic, is the rich and poor. So this is actually a famous um, picture, and this was from 2004, where a photographer took a Vieira captured the image of a favela. It's a poor neighborhood next to a rich neighborhood in Sao Paulo in Brazil. So you can actually see that they're literally separated by a fence. Okay, so this is where you have the poor people live, and this is where you have the rich. You can see everybody pretty much has their own pool in this apartment complex. So when asked about in an interview, they asked the photographer, about this image, and the question was, "What does the photo show in your opinion?" And he replied, "It's clearly an illustration of the social inequality, maybe the biggest problem of Brazil and Latin America. The unjust and brutal difference between rich and poor, inherited from slavery, is in the origin of many other problems: violence, below par schooling, prejudice, and many other issues. And inequality means that someone who is poorer is obliged to work more. They have no time to study, which impacts on their education. As a result, they are not able to develop the critical skills, develop the critical and political awareness necessary to transform their lives." And their own situation. Add to this the absence of any sense of collective responsibility or solidarity among the privileged in Brazil, and you have a closed circle that is very difficult to break. So this is from an interview that was given in the Guardian newspaper. Now the question for you is, do you think there is also a contrast between the rich and the poor in the United States, and why? Okay, so this is a question that we have to keep in mind because, as we mentioned, there are some similarities between some of the aspects of Latin America with the United States. So this would be one of them. Okay. Now, other contrasts that the article states are the city and the countryside, agricultural and industrial nations. And towards the end of the article, the authors mentions that Latin America is a region rich in paradoxes. Okay, so one of them is young and old. So, for example, on the other hand, most nations of Latin America obtained political independence from Spain and Portugal in the early 19th century, more than 100 years before successful anti-colonial movements in other third world countries, they call third world countries, and thus by the standard of nationhood, Latin America is relatively old because, for example, Algeria became independent from France in the 1960s. But at the same time, if you think about other nations, right, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, so they have been around for hundreds, some of them thousands of years. Okay, so Latin America is new in comparison to them, but also old comparing to other countries, other regions who became independent from colonial rule, as I mentioned, such as Algeria, okay, in the 1960s, who became independent from France. Another paradox is that Latin America is both tumultuous and stable, is independent and dependent, it's prosperous and poor. So I hope that you learned something in this lecture, and the hope is that you have a more informed view of this region beyond the stereotypes and be aware of the complexities of Latin America. Okay, so thank you so much for your attention to this lecture. If you have any questions, let me know. And I look forward to your discussions for this week. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. And goodbye.